Alright guys, this is Mr. Nijkamp, and pay attention, be sure you have your notes out as we go through the topic of coordinate graphing. The first term I'm going to go over is coordinate graph. You can see here that the definition is a display in which an ordered pair of numbers is displayed as a dot located on a grid. Coordinate graphs can actually be used for a lot of things. We're going to take a look at a coordinate graph here on the next slide. So here is a coordinate graph. You can see it's a grid with a couple different axes on it. We'll get what axes are in a minute. But we can plot what are called ordered pairs of numbers on this graph. And again, we'll get into how to do that. Now, a coordinate graph can be used for lots of different things. You can plot figures on it, and you can use information on the graph to reflect or turn those figures. You can also graph algebraic expressions, believe it or not, and use the graph to find some solutions for algebraic expressions, or possibly take two algebraic expressions and find a solution where both of those have something in common. You can even make predictions by graphing expressions. Our next term in the vocabulary list is quadrants. A quadrant is defined as the four sections that a coordinate graph is split into when the x and y axis are drawn. So let's take a look at the coordinate graph again. Here's a coordinate graph, and again you can see that it's separated by some lines and some arrows. The quadrants themselves we label those as 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we label quadrant 1 right here, and we usually use Roman numerals. 2, 3, and quadrant 4. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that the numbers are communicating things. We'll get to that in a minute as well. Now we come to the x and y axes. The x-axis is the horizontal number line on a coordinate plane. So the key word there is horizontal. The y-axis is the vertical number line on a coordinate graph. And again, the key word there is vertical. So here's our coordinate graph again, and if you look closely you can see some axes running through the middle. These lines here with the arrows on them are called axes. This one's vertical, and if you look closely here there is a y attached to that, and this one is horizontal, and again if you look closely you can see a little x here. So the vertical one is the y-axis, the horizontal one is the x-axis. We can also start talking about plotting points at this point. Usually we put points inside of parentheses, and we always write the x-coordinate in the first spot and the y-coordinate in the second spot. We talked earlier about the quadrants, the first one in the upper right-hand corner being 1, 2 for the upper left-hand corner, 3 for the bottom left-hand, and 4 for the bottom right hand. One thing to keep in mind is what these quadrants tell us. If we are in quadrant 1 and you look at the numbers, you can see that both numbers, this is the x-coordinate and the y-coordinate, are positive. If we go to quadrant 2 and you look down at the numbers here, you can see that the x-coordinate is negative and the y-coordinate is still positive because we're above the x-axis and those numbers are positive. In the third quadrant, we are to the left, which are negative numbers again, and we are to the below the x-quadrant, which are negative y, so we would have two negative coordinates. And then in the fourth quadrant, we have positive x-coordinates because we are to the left, or to the right of the y-axis. And we have negative y-coordinates because we are below the x-axis. So depending how we write our numbers with positives and negatives, it tells you what quadrant those numbers or the point belongs into. We're getting near the end of our vocabulary here. An ordered pair is a pair of numbers, and I kind of introduced that in the previous slide, x and y. And again, the first number is an x, and the second number is a y, and it tells us the location of the dot on the grid. And again, this is done by stressing the idea of positive and negative numbers. So we'll take a look at that on the next slide. So let's take a look at an example of an ordered pair a moment. Let's do an ordered pair coordinate of 6, 5, and see where that would fall on the coordinate plane. The first thing to remember is that the 6 is an x coordinate and the 5 is a y coordinate. Now the other thing to remember is that x is the horizontal axis and y is the vertical axis. So if we're looking for 6 on the x-axis, you will find it right here. And if you are looking for 5 on the y-axis, you will find it right there. And if you intersect those two, you kind of go along here until you get to the 6, and the 6 there. The point 6, 5 falls right at that point in the grid. If we look at another example, let's say we have the example of -10 and 4. Again, the -10 is an x coordinate, 4 is a y coordinate, and so we have to look on the x, which again is the horizontal axis, and find -10, which is right there. The y is 4, it is positive, so it is up here, and again we look for those intersecting points. So on the coordinate graph, that point would be right here. That would be the point -10, 4. Let's just look at a couple other point examples. What happens if you have 0 in the coordinates? If I put a 0 in for an x and say -2 for y, where would that be on the coordinate plane? 0 means we are actually on the axis. So 0 for x means there's no change this way or this way. So that means we are directly on the y-axis. So where is -2 on the y-axis? That is right there. So the point 0, -2 would be directly on the y-axis at the -2 point. The opposite would be true if the 0 is in the y-coordinate. So if we have coordinates like 8, 0, the 0 indicates that there's no movement vertically. So that would fall directly on the x-axis. So there'd be no movement this way or no movement this way. The coordinate would be directly on the x-axis. So we would find 8 on the x-axis, and that point would be 8, 0. Our final definition on the vocabulary is origin. You can see here the point 0, 0 on the coordinate graph is that definition. And if we look at a blank coordinate graph again, the origin would be directly in the middle where the x and y axes intersect. So this point here is 0, 0. This is known as the origin. Now we're going to do some practice, so pay attention and look at the blank spaces in your notes on the coordinate graphs and fill them in as we do our notes at this point. The first sample problem you come across says, graph the following points on the coordinate graph below. And you're given the points of C, -3, 5. Remember, the first number is the x-coordinate. So what we have to find first is -3 on the x, and that is right here on your coordinate graph. And 5 is the y-coordinate, so that is right here. Again, where they intersect is where that point is. So this would be point C. Looking at the next one, we have -2, 5. Again, -2 is the x-coordinate, so that is right here on the coordinate graph. And the 5 is the same place it was before. It is right here on the graph. So that point, if we graph it, would be right here. That would be point D. The third point is -8, -8. So we have an x-coordinate of -8, which is right here on the graph, and then we have a y-coordinate of -8, which is right here on the graph. And we look at where they intersect, and we put our point here. So Negative 8 would fall right here on the coordinate graph, and that would be point E. Okay, looking at point F and point G, why don't you quickly pause the video and try those on your own, and then when you hit unpause, I will have the solutions there for you. Alright, here are the solutions to those two. You should have put F over here, and you can see it is 4 up for the y coordinate and negative 10 over for the x, and G is right here, and you can see that is 6 over for the x and up 4 for the y to that point. Alright, here's the next problem of practice on your worksheet. It says indicate the coordinates for each point in the graph below. You can see here 5 different points are identified on this graph, and so let's go in alphabetical order here. The first point is C, and we would look at where C is, and it's right here on the graph, and we have to do some looking as to where it is. Now remember, the x is the horizontal component, and so that is that way, negative 6. So if I'm saying C is equal to something here, the x component is equal to negative 6. So I would write that like this. And then I would look at the y component, and we can see it's up, and it is up 6 position. So the y component is positive 6, and that is how we would write the coordinates for the letter C. If we go to D, we can see that the x component this time is over so many spots, and it's in the positive realm this time. So if I follow it along here, we can see that it is at 6 for the x, and the y component is up to 10. So the way we would represent D is the x component of 6 and the y component of 10 represents point D. E, we can see, is directly on the y-axis, so there is no horizontal component to it. So our x is 0 for that one, and the y, then we just look directly where it is on the y-axis. It's at negative 5. So that is that point. Okay, it's your turn to practice really quickly. Try points F and G on your own, so pause the video. Alright, the solutions for this one are as follows. If we look at F here, we see that F has a x component of 10, and so we would write that 10, and a y component, which is, it's down, so it's going to be negative, and we have to, it's right here, go across, and we have negative 7. So the coordinate for point F is 10, negative 7. For coordinate G, again, we have to look at the x coordinate first, and that is the horizontal component, and we hit G right here. So the x component is negative 9, and then the y is how far it goes down, and we go down to negative 8. So the point for G is, the coordinates for G is negative 9, negative 8. Alright guys, that's it. That was a tutorial for today. You have some practice problems to do, and those need to be done by tomorrow, so bring those to class with you complete, and we will check them in class tomorrow. Have a great day.